On our wedding day, the day I was supposed to be the happiest bride, I witnessed something that still replays in my mind every time I close my eyes. It wasn't a dream, nor a hallucination from exhaustion after the reception. It was a brutal, naked truth. In the bridal suite, heavy with the scent of roses and wine, I saw my husband, the man who had just taken my hand and sworn vows before hundreds of guests, holding my best friend. Their skin clung to one another as if the rest of the world had ceased to exist, as if I, his legal wife, had never existed in their secret story. I didn't scream. I didn't collapse into cinematic sobs. I froze, my gaze nailed to the scene, my whole body trembling. Part of me wanted to rush forward, tear apart the pristine white wedding dress that squeezed my body, and slap them both until they could no longer stand. But another voice whispered, "Don't. Let them know how much you hurt. Let them keep going without knowing you're watching." I bit down so hard. My tongue tasted metallic. The room was eerily silent except for the muffled moans and heavy breathing of the two betrayers. I had believed love was a sanctuary. 7 years together, so many shared memories, so many held hands and embraces after storms. He'd told me, "I only have you. I don't need anyone else." And my friend, the one who'd slept in the same bed during college nights, who'd lent me clothes and boxed lunches, who knew my deepest secrets, was the one to drive the knife into my heart alongside him. I remembered introducing them, trusting that they would be two of the most important people in my life. And yet now, on my wedding day, they entwined themselves in betrayal. I quietly closed the door, my hands so cold they shook as I gripped the handle. I turned and walked slowly down the red-carpeted hallway, where the lights from the ceremony still cast a warm glow. My heart felt crushed beyond measure, yet in that instant, a spark flared. I knew I couldn't let this end like this. I wouldn't run away like a defeated woman. I refused to become the pathetic bride people would pity and whisper about. No, I would rise. I would turn this pain into a weapon. The image of him bending to kiss her, his greedy hand pulling the wedding sheet to the floor, that image kept clawing at me. That white sheet, meant to symbolize purity and happiness, was now stained with lust and betrayal. I swore silently. He will pay. She will too. Neither of them will live in peace after making a mockery of me on the most important day of my life. I walked to the mirror and looked at my face behind the heavy makeup. The bride in the glass was no longer the bright, innocent woman from the morning. My eyes were cold, cavernous like a bottomless pit. Tears did not fall. They were unworthy. I forced a small, bitter smile, then ripped my veil down. Tonight, a part of me died. From this moment, another version of me was born, a woman who hides a blade behind her smile, who knows how to make others suffer while she keeps her composure. I stepped out of the suite, each step heavy but purposeful. In my mind, I began weaving the first threads of a plan, a game, a revenge, a chess match I would not lose. And they, the two betrayers, would never suspect that. In the bridal suite that night, I had quietly sown the seeds of their downfall. They tell you that love grows slowly, that it's the accumulation of small, ordinary things. Shared coffee mugs, late night talks, the way someone remembers how you take your tea. When I look back on my 7 years with him, that's the story I used to tell myself. We had the photographs to prove it. Holidays, silly selfies, the blurry snap of us on a rainy afternoon under one umbrella. We built an ordinary life that felt, at the time, like a fortress. I never imagined the fortress had a secret back door. We met in the most ridiculous, cinematic way. A stupid coincidence at a bookstore. He reached for the same battered paperback as I did. Our hands brushed. We laughed. He had a crooked grin that made it easy to forgive him anything. He called me after that day as if it was the most natural thing in the world to keep calling. We dated. We moved in. We argued about dishes and bills and whether to get a dog. He took care of me through a miserable cold season when I couldn't get out of bed. He introduced me to his mother, who insisted on feeding me until I threatened to run away. He said the right things in the right tone. He was the kind of man you would bet your entire life on, because who would bet against someone who held you through a storm and promised never to let go? And then there was her, my best friend. We met in university, two messy girls who shared a desk and a love for late-night noodles. She knew every scar on my heart and every ridiculous dream I whispered into the dark. We were inseparable in a way that was almost religious. Study sessions, shared makeup, the kind of secrets that cement friendships into something more like family. She knew the words he used to say to make me feel wanted. She knew my childhood nicknames. If you had asked me then whether she would ever betray me, I would have laughed, offended at even the suggestion. It was unthinkable. Meaningful lies don't usually arrive like a punch. They start as whispers, as small distortions you convince yourself aren't worth confronting. In the months leading to the wedding, there were tiny splinters. A late-night text that he slipped his phone away to hide a lipstick scar on the collar of a shirt he blamed on a wine stain. A laugh, a little too close to the screen, when a message came from I noticed. But I explained them away. I wanted to be the kind of woman who trusted. I wanted my wedding to be a festival of trust. There were also practical things that seemed to point to trouble if I had only been braver. He started working longer hours. And when I asked, he gave me believable reasons. An important project, a deadline, a client meeting. He smiled and kissed me on the forehead and said, "Everything's for us." I believed him. We had been planning this day for 18 months. The venue, the cake tasting, the choreography of who would dance with whom. It seemed everything in the world had been arranged to hold us together. But the first real crack came not with rage, but with a quiet, unputdownable feeling of being slightly off. Once, a month before the wedding, I was scrolling through old photos with her, half distracted, when I noticed a comment on one of his posts. A heart and a flame, and an emoji. I casually asked her about it, expecting a joke or a shrug. She took a long time to answer. "Oh, that. It's nothing," she said. She avoided my eyes. That should have been the moment I asked more questions. Instead, I folded it into a story I preferred to believe. Maybe people found us enviable. Maybe the internet was dumb. I was choosing comfort over confrontation. The wedding preparations consumed me in the best, most exhausting way. There were flowers to pick, vows to rehearse, a dress that made me feel immortal. He would stand by me at the altar and say my name and mean it. Hetolma had he been waiting his whole life for this. I wanted to believe him with the kind of faith that doesn't question miracles. There were, of course, moments when my intuition made a small, desperate noise. Once, a week before the wedding, I found a receipt in the laundry, a late-night coffee at a boutique cafe I'd never heard him praise. I asked about it. He smiled and said, "Meeting a client." Later that night, I heard laughter in my living room through the open curtains and saw two silhouettes that made my stomach flip. I told myself it was neighbors. I told myself I was being silly. It's amazing how resourceful denial can be when the alternative is unbearable. She, my friend, started showing up in ways that would have made perfect sense had I not trusted her. She volunteered to help with RSVP lists and seating charts. She was at every fitting, smoothing the hem of my dress like some guardian of my joy. At family dinners, she sat like a second sister, holding my mother's hand and making small jokes that made us all laugh. I watched her do all of this and convinced myself that the intimacy we had cultivated meant she would never become a threat. What I didn't see were the moments behind closed doors. There were, according to the traces that later unfolded, long and furtive messages, jokes that turned into confidences that turned into secret meetings. He had a knack for making me believe the story he wanted me to believe. He told me he loved me so convincingly, it became a warm blanket. And she smiled at me at the table and said, "I'm so happy for you." But the smile could hide a collision course. The more I look back, the more I recognize the ordinary pieces of betrayal. There were small shifts in their language, nicknames shared over drinks, private in-jokes that excluded me. There were times when I would walk into a room and their laughter would stop, as if a switch had been clicked off. I told myself it was nothing. I clung to the version of us that existed in the safe place of my head, the version that had whispered promises beneath street lights. In the last week before the wedding, the tremor in my gut grew louder. I began to snoop, not because I wanted to, but because the truth had started to feel like an impending storm. I would find a message thread that ended too abruptly when I entered a room. I'd notice a lipstick I didn't own on the rim of a wine glass and force it into my explainable box. Each small thing stacked upon the other, a leaning tower of unease I refused to demolish. On the eve of the wedding, I remember sitting alone in our kitchen, the house stripped of guests and the day's festivities, the clock ticking in a way that sounded like a countdown. I felt ridiculous, paranoid, but I couldn't shake the weight of suspicion. I opened his laptop, a betrayal I would regret 1,000 times over, and found a thread of messages that were more tender than any friend talk should be. They weren't explicit, not at first, but they had a rhythm that suggested privacy, intimacies shared in the dark. I closed the laptop and stood, hands trembling. I thought of confronting him then and there, of ripping off my veil and demanding the truth in the rawest voice I could muster. But I imagined the wedding day ruined, the flowers trampled, my mother's face crumpled in front of relatives. I imagined walking away with the humiliation hanging like a neon sign. And so, I decided, in the dazed, desperate logic of a woman trying to preserve some dignity, to push the alarm bell down. I told myself I'd gather more proof. I'd be clever about it. I would not give them the satisfaction of watching me fall apart in public. I would be the one to choose the battlefield. That night, I slept in a kind of feverish half-sleep. The rest of the apartment full of decorations for the day that would now be a mockery by morning. I remember the way the streetlight through the curtains painted a rectangle of light across the bed, like a stage. The knowledge that something was being hidden just beyond that rectangle felt like an omen. On the morning of the wedding, as I sat getting my hair done, I noticed her in the corner of the room. She was helping me with the final touches, her hand steady as she pinned the veil. She leaned in and whispered something about nerves, and I felt a sliver of relief because she was there, present in the most visible way. She laughed and brushed a strand of hair from my face. We exchanged a look that had been forged through nights of shared fears and hopes. I remember thinking, in that small moment, that maybe I had been letting shadows speak louder than reality. Now, I know what I didn't then. People who betray you will practice their lies until they become muscle memory. They will hide in plain sight. They will make a theater of normality so convincing that even the most attentive person will believe the scene. I was distracted by the performance, the rehearsed jokes, the knowing glances placed just so, and I forgot to watch the actors. I trusted the choreography. If there is one cruel truth about betrayal, it's this. There are 1,000 small opportunities to step away, to question, to catch the truth. Each one I passed up felt like a brick I added to the wall that would imprison me. I wanted my wedding to be perfect. I wanted to be the kind of woman who believed in lasting vows and honest faces. I wanted to trust the man who had once made me feel indestructible. So I walked down the aisle with my head held high, with a dress that made me feel as if I could stop time. I smiled at faces turned toward me, and I said yes to a voice I had loved for nearly a decade. The room applauded. I thought I could hear the future unfolding in that applause. What I didn't know, what I could not have known, was that behind the closed door of the bridal suite, where the veil would later be torn and a white sheet dragged to the floor, another story had already been written. A story that turned every promise I had ever accepted into a lie. That giddy faith I carried down that aisle, the irrational, silly trust that made me promise him the rest of my life would be the fuel for what came next. Because when faith is betrayed, you either crumble under the weight, or you reshape it into something that can burn through deceit. I chose the latter, though I didn't know it yet. I only knew the taste of betrayal was sour in my mouth, and that the world I'd planned on living in was gone. They tell you friendship is supposed to be a harbor, a place where storms don't touch you, where someone knows the shape of your scars and keeps their hands gentle. Ours was that kind of friendship on paper. We were the pair who arrived together at lectures, who braided each other's hair at midnight before exams, who traded boyfriends' secrets like they were recipes. She knew how I breathed when I was afraid. She was the one I called at 3 a.m. when loneliness knocked. She was the one I chose to stand beside me when I said yes to him. That's why the betrayal of a friend feels like a personal erasure. It's not just that she took him, it's that she took my history, the private library of my life, and rearranged it to suit her appetite. In the months after the wedding, the months I would later piece together with the cold precision of someone cataloging evidence, I kept replaying the mundane things and finding new, poisonous meanings in them. We had rituals. Every Sunday morning, we drank terrible coffee on the balcony and argued about everything and nothing. She would show up at my apartment with boxed pastries and dramatic gossip, the kind that made my mother laugh. She smelled like jasmine and laundry detergent, like home. She had a way of leaning into me during sad films, as if our bodies were a single refuge. I remember once telling her, half joking, "If the apocalypse comes, I want you by my side." She'd laughed and squeezed my hand like she meant it. And yet, beneath that laughter, there were small displacements I didn't want to notice. She started finishing his sentences in a tone that fit too comfortably, as if she'd practiced being inside his head. She began to adopt little gestures of his, a way of tilting her head when amused, a specific, private smile he reserved for me. When he said something romantic to me at dinner, she would blink slowly, like an audience member savoring a favorite line. I told myself I was being neurotic. I wanted my friendship to be stronger than the petty parts of jealousy. When people betray you, they usually do it with incremental expertise. They learn the seams of your life and tug them silently. She learned the rhythm of our homecoming, the way he preferred his coffee, the song that made him quiet, the small insult he'd throw that actually meant affection. She knew how I planned our weekends and how he loved the same corner in our favorite restaurant. She could mimic intimacy so precisely it felt like a forgery that passed for the original. There were moments when her face made me uneasy. Once, at a rooftop bar, she sat between us and laughed at something he said. Her laughter had an edge that smelled like territory taking. Later, I caught her watching me with a look that was almost admiration, but not for me. It felt like she was appreciating what she had engineered. That realization was a bullet of ice I swallowed whole. The strangest thing is how expertly she kept it folded into normality. She provided alibis and rituals that nobody questioned. She would offer to house sit. When we traveled, she would curate playlists for our car rides. She would bring over emergency chocolate on exams. Her betrayals did not announce themselves with thunder. They were stealthy, sewn into the fabric of everyday care. When I began to suspect, I tested her in childish ways. I'd tell her little believable lies, a fake meeting time, a false errand to see if she slipped. Sometimes, she would keep her composure and shift the conversation in a way that made me feel ridiculous for asking. Other times, a comma of hesitation would betray her, tiny and human. Those small hesitations multiplied in my mind like a slow-growing fungus, proof that rot can live just beneath polished surfaces. One morning, 3 months before the wedding, I found myself at her flat by accident, or so she said. She answered the door in my favorite old t-shirt of mine, one I thought I'd left at her place years ago. We sat on the floor and ate noodles from tins, while the rain performed its soft percussion outside. She spoke about my wedding as if she were composing a speech patient, glowing, absolutely sincere. In the middle of the conversation, her phone buzzed. She glanced at it, and for a sliver of a second, an expression crossed her face that did not match the conversation. Something intimate, something private that did not include me. I laughed it off and forced us back to the small jokes we used to tell. The deeper the timeline unspooled, the more I discovered the architecture of their affair. It was not just stolen nights. It was a network of excuses, whispered meetings, and code words. He had a habit of calling a certain bar the writer's hideout, and she started frequenting it with a book that conveniently required reading in public. They developed a vocabulary, pet names, little emojis sent at 2 a.m., cryptic references to an inside joke only they shared. It was like watching a map reveal a trail you had been walking on unaware. Then there were the moments of cognitive dissonance that make you question your own sanity. She would be the one to comfort me after an ugly fight with him. She would fix my hair and say, "He loves you. You know that." And my heart would do a ridiculous, painful thing. It would want to trust her again. She would volunteer to photograph us for the engagement shoot and take pictures that made me look luminous. Meanwhile, she was learning how to position herself in the frame where he's reached for me, learning how to stand close enough that familiarity would feel effortless later. I remember, with a kind of forensic clarity, the day I found a receipt tucked into the back of a novel she lent me, a receipt for a hotel minibar. Dated on the same afternoon he claimed he was at the office. It was stupid in a way. A single piece of paper, a tiny proof, but it cracked my denial. I took the receipt and held it like a talisman of cruelty. I wanted to throw it out, to deny that it belonged to them, to fold it into the great archive of misunderstandings. Instead, I made a decision I would not undo. I would keep collecting, quietly, like an archivist of hurt. Collecting evidence felt like learning a language, the language of hidden lives. I started to notice patterns. Messages deleted at odd hours, unexplained lipstick on a napkin, a scent on his coat that wasn't mine. Each little thing was a syllable of their secret. they had become fluent in concealment. What was worse than the hiding was the casualness with which she moved through my life after each theft. She was at every family event, smiling politely, while my mother praised her for being such a devoted friend. She would sit next to me at dinners and brush crumbs off my lap. I wanted to confront her in that moment, to rip apart the calm facade and demand the truth. But each time I imagined the scene, an image bloomed in my head that stopped me. My father's red face, my mother's hands trembling, relatives whispering. I had built a life large enough that the public collapse seemed unbearable. So instead, I did what I have since learned to do well. I watched. I learned the art of appearing unknowing. I smiled. I kept playing the role of the grateful bride-to-be, while my senses gathered what I could not bear to say out loud. I learned the weight of pretending. And in all of this, there was a smaller, crueler betrayal. The part of me that wanted to forgive, because forgiveness felt like an easier path. At night, I would imagine different versions of events. Maybe they had a moment. Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe it was fixable. Those imaginings were sedatives, brief and false. They soothed me until I woke up with a taste of betrayal again. As the wedding drew closer, the frequency of the signs increased, like the tempo of an orchestra building toward a climax. They moved closer in the choreography of my life. My friend began to joke about being my maid of honor in a voice that sounded rehearsed. He would brush my shoulder at parties and say, "You look beautiful." Her hand would find his back with a reliability that was no longer coincidental. I walked among them like a ghost in what was supposed to be my life. The tragedy of it was not just the act itself, it was the slow, surgical unmasking of the trust we had made into a home. She had become an inhabitant of my private spaces, one who had learned which doors could be opened without an alarm. By the time I had the proof, the receipt, the late-night text, the whispered confession caught by chance, the betrayal had already had months to seed itself into my bones. When you realize your best friend has been your rival all along, the shape of the world changes. The people you trusted become strangers with familiar faces. I spent nights cataloging memories, turning them over like stones, to see if any glittered with truth. I felt like a curator in a museum of my own life, walking past exhibits that now looked fraudulent. And yet, even with that knowledge, even with the proofs that made the betrayal undeniable, I did not rush to the altar and tear the vows to pieces. I put on my dress. I walked down the aisle. I said the words. I decided to let the tempest gather strength quietly, to become something precise instead of a raw, unthinking collapse. I would not give them the satisfaction of watching me break. I would not let them claim the spectacle, because revenge, which I named later as strategy, required patience. And patience, in this case, was the only weapon left to a woman whose two most intimate sanctuaries had been turned against her. The bridal suite had been arranged to look, for everyone else, like the last polished scene of a fairy tale. Fresh roses in glass vases, a scatter of confetti still catching light, the faint perfume of the cake frosting clinging to the air like sweetness that would not wash out. For me, that tableau was a cruel stage set that framed the scene I could not unseen. When I pushed the door open, the world narrowed to the two of them. I remember the peculiar clarity of details, the way his tie was half undone, the way the strap of her dress had slipped off one shoulder like a deliberate punctuation. Their movements weren't cinematic. They were clumsy and human, urgent in a way that made me angrier than anything else. Anger, I learned, is a hot, combustible thing that strips away the softer feelings. It allows you to catalog, to notice, to store evidence like someone taking inventory of a crime scene. I did the impossible. I watched every small thing. I watched the way his hand hesitated on her back before committing, the soft sigh she made that sounded like a secret being sealed. I watched the way the lights reflected off the wedding band that still sat on his finger. I watched how she trembled the way you do when you are both thrilled and afraid. I watched the intimacy that had been shared between them become an act of erasure in front of my eyes. I watched them turn the vows we had just exchanged into a spectacle of mockery. My breath shortened. A panic rose like a tide, hot and immediate. But I folded it down and became a machine of observation. I saw the detail that finally became the hinge of everything. A sliver of text on his phone screen, the small ping of a message that popped up, and then, hurriedly, his thumb flicked it away. He did not notice I had seen it. For a moment, that flashing line of text was the only light in the room that mattered. It was proof, ephemeral and perfect, and I put it away in my mind like a coin into a safe. At some point, they heard the door. They froze in a way that revealed their guilt, even without words, a slow-motion flicker, where someone becomes aware they've been observed. He tried to button up his shirt. She smoothed the fabric of her dress as if she might iron out culpability. Their faces did what traitors' faces do. They rearranged into something that might pass if you glanced quickly. But I did not glance quickly. I absorbed the whole tableau, the crushed petals strewn on the carpet, the overturned wineglass, the sheet dragged to one side. The room smelled like perfume and spilled champagne. And beneath everything, the metallic tang that had become my private background noise these past weeks. Betrayal. I could have screamed. I should have rushed forward and ripped them apart with some physical catharsis. But something colder, more strategic, settled in my chest. The decision to stay silent was not courage so much as deliberate coldness. Let them think they had gotten away with it. Let them feel safe in their little bubble of triumph. Let them not know I had catalogued every lie. In that split second, I chose a path that required patience and cruelty in equal measure. Instead of confronting them, I retreated. Quietly, with the grace of someone who had practiced composure, I closed the door behind me and walked down the corridor, heels clicking on the polished floor like a metronome. Each step felt like a removal. I was taking myself out of a scene they had performed in, but with every step, I also carried the scene inside me like contraband. In the silence of the hallway, the applause and laughter from downstairs turned into a far-off soundtrack, incongruent with the ruin inside me. I found myself in the restroom, turning the tap on and letting cool water hit my wrists. The splash of water anchored me in the physical world. I breathed in and out, allowing the shock to unspool into something more manageable. Anger, a plotting instinct, a harsh lucidity. I knew, at that moment I knew, the only way to survive this was to record, to collect, to weaponize the truth. So I began with what was closest first. I forced myself to remember exact words. Memory is fickle under stress, but you can train it. I repeated sentences in my head. The way he cursed the noise of the reception, the way she called his name like a stolen prayer, the syllables of whispered jokes that later would sound like admissions. I cataloged sounds, the cadence of their breathing, the way fabric rustled. I cataloged objects, the lipstick on the glass, the smear of mascara on a tissue, the way the belt of his jacket had been tossed on a chair. Each detail was a small shard that, together, would make a case. I went back once more, not to confront, but to gather. I opened the door just enough to slip inside and pick up the phone that lay face down on the bedside table. He had thrown it there in haste. It was warm. My hands did not shake as much as I thought. Adrenaline steadied them. I thumbed the screen and looked for the message thread. There it was, a list of timestamps and fragments of language that made my stomach turn. Late nights, affectionate emojis, little nicknames that had never been meant for me. I took photos with my own phone, the mechanical act of documentation, a dull, legalistic ritual. I traced the phone's recent calls and messages, making a mental list of the times that contradicted the alibis he had given. I even found a small, idiotic thing that somehow became a keystone. A pressed flower between pages of a book on his nightstand. The kind of thing a person keeps because it is a token. That flower had been mine once. I had pressed it inside a book years ago and given it to him. Seeing it there in a place that had nothing to do with me was a benediction of the betrayal's intimacy. I photographed it. Every image was a ledger entry in a dossier I was beginning to build. Then I did something colder. I put the phone back exactly where I had found it. I smoothed the sheet so the little upheaval would not call attention. I left no fingerprints that might alert them to my trespass. The performance of normalcy mattered as much as the calories of proof in my pocket. I wanted them to continue as if nothing had happened, because their continued comfort would make later revelations more destructive. Outside the suite, I took a breath and walked straight to the small study we had at home. I was not thinking of rushes of drama. My thoughts were pragmatic and clinical. I copied the photos from my phone onto a flash drive and hid it in a place I knew he would never look. Behind the false bottom of my jewelry box. I printed the photos and receipts I could access from the messages. I had always kept a printer in the house for reasons of convenience, and I placed them in a folder labeled wedding. It was the perfect lie. Who would suspect that the wedding folder contained the evidence of the wedding's greatest treachery? Throughout the reception, I played the role. I smiled at guests. I danced the dances we had planned, and when relatives toasted us, I clinked glasses like any bride. Each time his arm brushed mine, the skin on my forearm ignited. I let them soak in their false intimacy while I collected the currency I would later spend. When guests whispered that I looked radiant, I let the compliment sit on my face like a mask. Inside, wires were being laid, plans taking shape with the meticulousness of someone drafting a contract. That night felt like an enormous double life. The bride everyone saw, and the woman who had been betrayed and had already begun to file the claim. By choosing to gather rather than to explode, I preserved an advantage both theatrical and practical. Revenge, as I would learn, is less about catharsis and more about calculation. And in the hours following the humiliation, with champagne bottles being emptied and friends singing under strings of lights, I sat like a coiled thing, aware that my life had 3 acts from that moment. The innocence I had lost, the preparation of the revenge, and the eventual reckoning. Before sleep finally caught me a jittery, thin sleep, I wrote down times, placed small X marks next to names, and punched a hole through the middle of the folder so I could clip new leaves into it as they came. The act of documenting made my hands steady and my mind definite. It felt almost like laying a foundation stone for a house I would build out of truth. The next morning, my face on the bridal photos looked serene, even angelic. Inside the folder, behind the neat ceremony schedules and vendor contracts, lived the evidence of the first betrayal I had witnessed. It was hidden in plain sight, like a seed planted in the soil, under the very thing that would feed their arrogance. I smiled for guests. I learned then that some smiles are weapons. The choice not to explode that night, not to scream or drag them both out into the hallway by their hair, became the cornerstone of everything that followed. Rage burns fast, but strategy requires quiet. And I wanted strategy. I wanted something that would last, something that would carve itself into their lives the way their betrayal had carved into me. The next morning, I dressed in silence. I let him kiss my cheek with the same mouth that had whispered into her skin. I let her hug me tightly, arms warm and perfumed, as if nothing had broken. And in that moment, I realized the depth of my power. They thought I was blind. They thought the secret was safe. They thought I would live out my life with eyes shut, smiling and feeding them the comfort of ignorance. That illusion was going to become their prison. I began with evidence. Small, precise, and ordinary things. I saved receipts. I captured screenshots. I photographed traces of perfume on jackets. Tiny details that would look like nothing to anyone else but which, in context, told a story. I kept backups, hidden USB drives, taped under drawers, folders mislabeled in cloud storage. Each time I found something new, I cataloged it meticulously, almost clinically. It wasn't paranoia anymore. It was data collection. I was building a case file, piece by piece. And while I gathered, I performed. I leaned into my role as the loving wife. I cooked meals, posted photos of us smiling, let him hold me in public. Every kiss, every handhold, every affectionate gesture became a mask. My smiles grew sharper, more deliberate. I began to understand how an actress feels on stage. Applause ringing in her ears, while behind her ribcage burns an entirely different truth. She was harder to stomach. My best friend, my former best friend, continued to orbit my life with the enthusiasm of a sister. She came over often, offered to help decorate our new home, brought bottles of wine with ribbon tied around the neck. Each time she stepped across my threshold, I fought the urge to smash the glass in her hand and tell her I knew. Instead, I offered her a seat. I poured her wine. I laughed at her jokes. All the while, I was recording. My phone, placed discreetly near us, caught pieces of her words. Most were innocent, but sometimes, when she drank a little too much, her tone softened, became almost nostalgic. Once, she slipped and said, "Remember when before catching herself?" I didn't press. I smiled and asked about the wine. But inside, I marked it. Every slip was another nail in her coffin. I hired a private investigator. It felt theatrical at first, like something people only did in movies. But in reality, it was just another transaction. Money for truth. I handed over dates, locations, Patterns I had noticed. Within weeks, I had photographs. The two of them in restaurants, in parking lots, in the same apartment building. They were careful, yes, but not perfect. Lovers never are. They thought they were invisible. The camera proved otherwise. All of this I tucked away. I didn't confront, not yet. Because confrontation was not the point. Ruin was the point. I wanted their families to know, their colleagues to know, every person who had toasted us on our wedding day to see the photographs, the messages, the lies. I wanted them to taste public humiliation the way I had tasted private humiliation. But timing mattered. A blade doesn't cut if you swing it too soon. It needs to slide in at the exact moment of trust. So I played the long game. I began to set traps, subtle ones, to test their arrogance. I left questions. I mentioned places I knew they had been together, just to watch them flinch. I pretended to forget things, so they would speak more freely. Each time they thought they had gotten away, I wrote another note in my growing dossier. It was almost a kind of artistry, the patience of it, the precision. And as I gathered, something inside me changed. I was no longer the bride who cried into her pillow. I was something colder, sharper, a woman carrying a blade no one else could see. I found a new kind of calm in the act of preparing their destruction. It made me smile more genuinely in public, oddly enough. People said marriage looked good on me. They had no idea I was sharpening knives behind my back. When you've been betrayed so deeply, you learn the art of silence. Silence becomes a shield, but also a weapon, they thought. Silence meant ignorance. What they didn't understand was that silence is the sound of planning. And I was planning every single day. I learned to be an expert at appearing ordinary. There's a particular cruelty to pretending that nothing happened. It requires you to rehearse normality the way an actor rehearses lines, the laugh at the right pitch, the tilt of the head that signals interest without invitation, the effortless way you raise a glass and clink it with someone whose hands have already dirtied your life. I became fluent in those tiny gestures. I learned to make my face the most convincing mask in the room. Every morning, I woke up and chose a role. Wife, host, smiling bride in the album. I cooked the breakfasts he liked, folded the napkins the way my mother had taught me, asked about his day with innocent curiosity. When he kissed me, I returned the motion with practiced tenderness. When she came over for brunch, I braided her hair like nothing was broken between us. I laid out plates, poured coffee, and laughed at jokes, while my mind cataloged later moments where the same hands had made the same jokes in secret. It was exhausting to be pleasant, but it was necessary. I had to make them comfortable in their impunity. Their sense of safety became an asset I could exploit. Lovers who believe they have escaped detection are careless. Arrogance opens doors that prudence would close. My composure invited their arrogance. I watched them relax into the belief that whatever they were doing was invisible, and in that belief, they made mistakes. The private investigator arrived like a small, practical light, cutting through the fog of suspicion. He was nothing like the dramatic figures in the movies. No trench coat, no pensive cigarette, just a man with a professional calm and an expensive camera. I met him at a coffee shop and handed him the loose threads I had gathered. Times, places, names, the tiny receipts, the pressed flower. He listened without moralizing, his face neutral. Start with what you've given me. He sighed simply. I'll watch, and I'll document. You'll get reports. If there's anything I can't access legally, I'll tell you what we can and can't do. That was everything I needed. Authorization and a boundary. The work that followed was methodical. He surveilled like an archivist. Nights out, familiar haunts, the bar he'd called the writer's hideout. He followed patterns, which restaurants they favored, which coffee shops midday, which parking lots offered privacy. Photographs arrived in encrypted emails. Him leaving an apartment at dawn, her entering a building 2 hours later, their hands brushing in a cab. Each image removed the possibility of plausible deniability. What the photographs could not capture, the investigator's notes did. Hushed meeting times, phrases overheard by a careless waiter, the cadence of messages that betrayed a warmth reserved for something more than friendship. He delivered transcripts of public chats and flagged the times that matched the receipts and the hotel bookings. It was clinical and devastating. I read every file like someone reading a verdict I had written myself. The most painful images were never explicit. They were the glances that suggested continuation. The way his shoulder leaned toward hers in a photograph taken at a family barbecue. The way her fingers lingered in the group photo, as if she had adjusted his posture more than once. Lovers don't always need to be photographed in bed to show their truth. Sometimes, 1,000 small intimacies make the picture. Armed with proof, I felt strangely liberated and wildly dangerous. The dossier in my drawer grew fat and cold, filled with receipts, screenshots, and photographs, a paper life of their many small betrayals. I made copies and encrypted them in several places. I printed top-quality images and slid them into a locked cabinet labeled wedding. Preparation, I decided, was the only form of revenge I could plan with any dignity. But gathering evidence was only the first layer. The second and, in many ways, the more delicate part of the plan was manipulation. I began to orchestrate the environment around them, without them noticing the strings. I created situations that would measure their confidence. A postponed dinner here, a work emergency there, a casual remark about an old friend who knew too much. Each micromanipulation was a test. Would they hide? Would they slip? Would arrogance make them careless enough to leave a message unreadable to everyone but me? I learned to use technology as both shield and scalpel. I changed subtle details in our shared calendars, moving times 5 or 10 minutes here and there, just to see if a missed rendezvous would result in a panicked call or a flippant text. I let my phone sit within reach more often when she was around, its notifications sound a small trap. I'd ask him innocuous questions like, "Did you meet the client at the corner cafe or the one on 5th?" And watch whether his face tightened. Each tightening was an index. Each stammer, a witness. Social media became a stage. I posted photographs with captions carefully calibrated to provoke a reaction without appearing accusatory. A photo of me laughing with a friend at a place they'd been. A throwback image of him and me captioned with a private joke he loved. These were little provocations meant to observe, to make them reveal themselves in the comments or in private messages. I watched their reactions from a distance and noted which posts created a ripple and which did not. It was petty and effective. At times, to unsettle her, I let slip a memory in conversation, something private. A tiny detail from our youth that only someone who had been present could have known. I watched for the flicker of recognition, the micro-expression that betrayed awareness. Sometimes she smiled in a way that suggested she was pleased to be the keeper of the memory. Other times, she bit her lip as if the recall hurt. Both responses were data. Both responses told me more than the evidence alone. Inside our home, I rearranged small things to see whether he would notice. A book moved slightly on a shelf, a coffee mug placed where it hadn't been. I learned how oblivious they could be, and I took advantage. If they failed to note a difference, it told me how self-centered their attention had become. If they mentioned it, I could shape my reaction to create further opportunities for confession or overconfidence. Despite it all, my days were punctuated by a sick, private grief that returned in unexpected waves. Alone in the kitchen, late at night, I would find myself opening the wedding folder and looking at the photos of us from happier times. I'd remember the small, true things we had shared and feel physical pain. Then I would close the folder and remind myself why I had chosen this path. The revenge I was fashioning was not solely for spectacle. It was a reclamation of agency. I could have been a victim who shouted and wept, but I chose to be the one who set the terms. There were moments when my restraint felt like an insult to my own suffering. Friends asked me, privately, if I'd confronted him yet. I learned to nod and say, not yet, with a patience that was a tactic. Their sympathy was well-meaning, but not useful. I could not explain that each day I waited was a calculated move toward a more devastating truth. I could not tell them that the satisfaction I wanted was not immediate vindication, but the slow, satisfying collapse of the facade that had hurt me. Because while I was patient, I was also setting the stage for maximal visibility. I wanted his colleagues to see the photos. I wanted her family to recognize the patterns. I wanted the things people had whispered about us at my wedding to echo back at them with evidence they could not ignore. For that to be truly effective, for the humiliation to be absolute, timing was everything. The investigators' reports told me when they would be most vulnerable, when their guard would drop, when they'd tell themselves they were safe. So I kept smiling. I kept hosting dinners, I kept telling him how much I appreciated his help in planning the housewarming party we would soon throw. I watched him sink into complacency like a man slipping into a comfortable jacket he thought he owned. And all the while, I tightened the screws of my plan, one careful turn at a time. Revenge, I was learning, requires more creativity than anger. It requires the imagination to see which domino, when tipped, will bring down the largest structure. It requires patience to wait for the right gust of wind. And it requires stealth, the ability to be ordinary while orchestrating an extraordinary ruin. For now, the watchers were watching. The cameras had collected their truth. The dossier was thick, and I, smiling in public, calm and private, was the quiet catalyst waiting for the precise moment to fling open the curtains. Once the dossier had weight, once the images and timestamps and hotel receipts accumulated into something that felt like evidence rather than suspicion, the next horrible layer of truth began to betrayal. It turned out, had a taste for more than affection. It also had an appetite for convenience and gain. What had started as stolen moments began revealing itself as a pattern of calculated choices that reached into our finances, our family, and the scaffolding of our future. The private investigator's slow, patient work did more than capture embraces in shadowy corners. It revealed rhythms and routines that mapped onto bank statements and business trips. At first, it was small. A dinner bill to a corporate card he claimed was for a client meeting. A weekend work trip that lined up perfectly with a late-night taxi receipt and her entrance into a downtown apartment an hour later. The images connected to numbers, and numbers often tell the truest stories because they are hard to argue with. I started pulling our shared accounts, old invoices, and the innocuous paperwork I had trusted to him for safekeeping. There it was. Transfers that had been explained away as investments and business expenses. Amounts that, when aligned with the nights they'd been together, read like payoff notes. He'd positioned debts as opportunities. He'd framed secret banks of cash as legitimate. She was present in the ledgers, 2 small purchases charged to his accounts. Dinners written off as corporate hospitality that had more perfume than business purpose. The arithmetic of their story made my stomach drop. Their secret was not only emotional infidelity, it had become a quiet theft wrapped in intimacy. The betrayal of resources is an ugly, greedy thing, because it steals the future in calculable terms. A deposit here, a diversion there, and suddenly confident plans I had made a savings account for travel. The renovation we'd sketched on a napkin at midnight were shrinking without my knowledge. When I saw the spreadsheets line up with the photographs, the private, humiliating pain turned into a different kind of cold. This was not merely about humiliation anymore. It was about theft and deception that could be proven. I remember the night I realized how far it went. I sat at our kitchen table with the glow of my laptop and the investigator's most recent batch of photos opened beside my spreadsheet. The images showed them at a boutique hotel, laughing over room service, his hand an easy resting place at the small of her back. The bank transfers that corresponded felt like small detonations. Transfers to an account I didn't recognize, payments for flights that didn't fit the work itinerary, and a recurring expense listed under a company name that, when I looked into it, had been dissolved years ago. He had been creative in his explanations for months. He'd been creative at making lies look like paperwork. Knowing this changed the structure of my plan. The game was no longer only about ruin and humiliation. It was about reclaiming what was mine and ensuring the people who had used intimacy as convenience could not walk away clean. I realized the ledger of betrayal needed to be part of the public record, and that meant thinking beyond family dinners and into legal steps, where photocopies and timestamps carry weight. I consulted quietly with a lawyer, not to explode our marriage in a single dramatic scene, but to understand boundaries and to gather legal leverage. I asked about joint assets, the mechanics of claiming theft versus marital property, and the power of documented evidence versus he's scenarios. The lawyer's calm, practical advice reshaped my thinking. Public humiliation could be swift and satisfying, but protections afforded by courts and the clarity of legal filings could lock in outcomes. It was an ugly calculus, but one that felt righteous in its precision. While I organized this quieter, more administrative front, I noticed other currents. Their affair had consequences that rippled beyond us. There were subtle changes in how his office treated him. A small supervisor's remark here, a hushed phone call there. The investigator's photographs eventually made their way into the hands of a trusted colleague, not by me, but by sleight of hand. That felt like fate, who began asking questions in the right places. She, meanwhile, started fielding odd calls from her sister about charity donations she supposedly requested. Small threads began to pull at the seams of her careful life. With each pull, their arrogance frayed. The lover who had once walked confidently through life now had the nervous energy of someone who imagines they are always a step away from being discovered. He started arriving late to work with rumpled ties and bleary eyes. She began making excuses about sudden weekend trips she claimed were for family emergencies. Their complacency turned into clumsy attempts at plausible deniability, and those attempts only drew more attention. I also observed the way they tried to reorganize their world once suspicion threatened them. He began to speak differently in front of me, more generically, less affectionately. He scheduled meetings with clients that ended up being on the other side of the city from where the investigators' photos placed him. She, who had been so adept at performing sisterliness, grew defensive when I asked the smallest of harmless questions. Pride, which had once blinded them to consequences, now calcified into petulance. All the while, I fed these small slips into a broader strategy. The financial trail allowed me to nudge certain conversations toward formalities. A friendly talk with his boss about a new expense policy. A random mention to her family member about their recent generosity. Things that began to erect a scaffolding where truth could be displayed without me having to be the loud harbinger. I was building a legal and social architecture that would expose them not as lovers caught in a moment, but as people who had used intimacy as a ledger for selfish gain. Perhaps the cruelest part of this phase was watching them try to repair what they thought was breakable. They were not thinking about amends. They were thinking about damage control. He sent framed photos to his mother, carefully captioned with innocuous lines about proud moments. She posted staged images on social media of volunteer work and charity events. Their public personas were being polished, not repaired. It was nauseating to watch the vanity of their image-making when the rot had gone deeper than any caption could hide. And then, like any layered strategy built by a careful mind, there were risks. When plans start to rely on human unpredictability and legal inertia, there are variables you cannot fully control. I double-checked every file, re-verified every photograph's metadata, printed extra copies, and placed duplicates with people whose integrity I trusted. I made sure that if anything went wrong, if a file was deleted or a password changed, the truth would still breathe somewhere else, ready to be pulled into daylight. The emotional weather of this period was something like walking a tightrope over a canyon. Sometimes the wind was a gale of grief. Sometimes it was a quiet, satisfied warmth at another box checked, another ledger entry confirmed. I would wake up some mornings with a physical looseness, the kind that comes when a plan is working. And there were nights when I simply sat and allowed myself to feel the full magnitude of what had been taken. Feeling and planning were not mutually exclusive. They lived in awkward tandem. By the end of this phase, the story had become more complex than a simple tale of infidelity. It had become a tale of betrayal that exploited trust for material gain, a scheme that used intimacy as a means to an end. That complexity made the reckoning I was preparing feel both more necessary and more justified. I had built the dossier, lit the legal fuse, and nudged social gears into motion. The structure around them had become brittle. The rest would require only the right pressure in the right place at the right time. Once the ledger was heavy and the social scaffolding had been nudged into just the right creek, I started to weave traps that were equal parts theatrical and mundane. The aim was simple: create circumstances where their guard would drop and their confidence would perform for an audience I controlled. I wanted to make them actors in their own unmasking, to let their arrogance narrate the confessione had already documented. The plan began with something innocuous, a housewarming brunchi, announced as a small, informal gathering for close friends and a few co-workers. Nothing fancy, I told everyone, which was a lie, the way a magician lies about the trick he's about to perform. I invited his manager under the pretense of introducing him to the local team. I asked her cousin to come because I knew the cousin worked at the bank where some of the questionable transfers had passed through. I invited neighbors and a few mutual friends whose gossip I had already earned. The guest list was an ordinary thing, nothing suspicious to anyone who received it. But to me, it was a chessboard. Leading up to the event, I set I posted a casual photo from a rehearsal dinner the week before, captioned with a private joke he loved, and watched whether he'd respond publicly or privately. He responded privately. A sleepy logged, but did not use. I invited her to bring a dessert, knowing how she loved to present herself as the domestic, generous friend. She took the role with alacrity, arriving with a tart that smelled of lemon and perfumed confidence. On the day, I moved like someone comfortable in sunlight. I made sure the living room felt warm and welcoming. Fresh flowers in low vases, the playlist shuffled to the right nostalgia. Glasses filled, I greeted guests with a smile that had become my new currency. When his colleagues arrived, he hugged them, cheeks flushed from the small compliments. When her relatives came in, she hugged them tighter than necessary, like someone soaking up validation. I had arranged for the investigators' photos to be printed on high-quality paper and placed into a discreet folder labeled Household Receipts. Only one person in the room knew that folder's contents, a trusted friend who nodded at me once per our quiet signal. The plan was not simply to hand out photos like napkins. The plan was to let curiosity guide the reveal. To make someone else, accidental but perfectly placed, stumble across the evidence and ignite a sequence that couldn't be controlled. Then I did something I had never expected to do. I invited his mother to sit next to me on the couch during dessert. She had always been gentle, the kind of woman who made comfort a religion. I had my reasons. Her presence would lend credibility to whatever was to come. People lean on maternal faces when the world feels unstable. I wanted her to be the anchor for disbelief when the truth hit. The first domino fell without fanfare. A friend, the one I trusted to be the spark, knocked over the coffee table while reaching for a dish. The folder slid out from beneath a napkin and fanned open, photos catching the light like a small geometric confession. The room quieted. An awkward pause lodged itself between the clinking of forks and the hum of polite conversation. Eyes drifted to the images. My heart beat loud enough to be audible, but my face kept its practiced blankness. He laughed, nervy and thin, and reached to close the folder. "Oh, those are just," he began, attempting the kind of casual dismissal people use when they can fake normality into existence. But his hand trembled enough that the images slid, exposing more than he intended. Someone with sharper eyes. His manager recognized an address in the corner of a receipt. A cousin at the table noticed a hotel logo he'd seen before. I watched the mental gears in their heads engage, watched assumptions be replaced by a slow, dawning comprehension. That was when I let the room do its work. I did not have to be the prosecutor. The photographs were the accusation. My friend who had knocked the table kept playing the same role. Puzzled, she mouthed the names under her breath, and then asked the kind of disarming question that explosively enlarges suspicion. "Is this from last month?" The simple inquiry made the timeline explicit. The conversation pivoted from awkwardness to alarm. He attempted to explain, clumsy, apologetic, his voice the pitch of a man caught between panic and calculated denial. She laughed too quickly, eyes darting. But denial is a fragile thing when paired with evidence. As he spoke, others at the table cross-referenced their turns in the photographs with places they recognized, with dates that sat in the back of their minds. Small, inadvertent confirmations began to surface. A colleague remembered seeing him in town at a strange hour. A neighbor recalled his car parked in front of an apartment building on a Tuesday morning when he had told them he was at a conference. The scene disintegrated the way a bad actor's mask might. Flustered, then defensive, then petty, he tried to reposition the narrative. Business dinners, an affair of the heart, mistake, a moment of weakness. She blurted that she'd been there for me, and that their friendship had meant nothing beyond comfort. Their attempts at improvisation were hollow, because the photos were not solitary confessions. They were connected to bank records and receipts, all of which had been quietly echoed into the right ears before the brunch. I watched as the murmurs grew louder, as people shifted from polite to incredulous. I watched his mother's face go from confusion to a slow, white astonishment. And then the phone calls began. Someone texted his supervisor a link to an image. Another guest sent an encrypted photo to a person in finance. The information spread in a way I had predicted but never wanted to orchestrate. Publicly enough to matter, privately enough to be irreversible. They were being contained by their own network, and the net closed with a terrible politeness. What struck me, and it felt like both cruelty and relief, was the speed at which the social world turned on them. The boss excused himself to take a call. The cousin at the bank asked for details and then requested copies of the receipts. The brunch that had been designed to be cozy had become a crucible. They no longer had the luxury of plausible deniability. The evidence had been distributed into places where reputations, livelihoods, and familial respect were evaluated. I watched them shrink. He blamed stress, poor judgment, whatever small excuses keep humans from owning up to their basest selfishness. She cried once, not from remorse, but from fear. Fear of what the exposure would mean for the neat life she had curated. It was ugly and human to see them panic, and the sight of it made something in me loosen that had been taut for months. In that loosening there was a bright, small thing that looked very like satisfaction. Still, there was more to do. Public humiliation had a satisfying sting, but I had also prepared legal routes. The bank files started to move the way a well-placed nudge does. Questions to accounting, flags on certain transactions, whispers that moved into formal emails. I had already consulted with a lawyer who had advised on how to leverage the evidence in ways that would not only expose them, but protect my claims. The brunch had done what it needed to do. It had accelerated the social and bureaucratic machinery. By the evening, their world had several visible cracks. Colleagues were uncomfortable. Family members were whispering, and the bank's compliance team had been alerted to transactions that required investigation. The montage of photos, receipts, and witness testimonies began to read not as a private melodrama, but as a pattern that could not be dismissed as youthful folly. As guests left, some offered me condolences with surprising awkwardness. Others hugged me as if I'd been a victim freed from a small torture. I accepted some embraces and refused others. I had wanted exposure, not shallow sympathy, but acknowledgement that the truth finally had a voice. The house felt lighter, as if the act of letting the evidence breathe had released a pressure I had carried in my chest. When the last car pulled away and the confetti of crumbs was swept by a neighbor's broom, I sat down with the folder and a glass of untouched wine. I opened the files and leafed through them like a reader, savoring the final chapter. The strategy had worked. The social scaffolding had been destabilized. Their arrogance had been punctured. The legal gears were turning. This was not the end. It was the moment when the architecture I had built would either buckle under the strain or hold firm and deliver the ruin I had drafted. There would be more calculations, more meetings, more hard proofs to supply. But for the first time since that night in the bridal suite, I felt something even sharper than grief, a fierce clarity. They had been exposed in the light I had chosen, and in that light, they were smaller than I had imagined. The brunch had been the spark. But sparks are not enough. You need fire to burn through the scaffolding of lies. And fire requires oxygen. I knew exactly where to find it. Family gatherings, the places where pride and shame are magnified under the gaze of blood relatives. It was time to let the betrayal live not only in photographs and whispered questions, but in the full glare of people who mattered most to them. I chose a family dinner. The occasion was ordinary enough. A monthly gathering where his parents, siblings, and a few cousins came together to eat, laugh, and compare the small victories and defeats of life. I volunteered to host, smiling sweetly when I extended the invitation. He looked proud, oblivious to the fact that I was sharpening the blade behind my back. She was invited too, naturally. She had always been part of these dinners, introduced as my best friend to anyone who didn't already know her. I insisted on her presence, almost begged her to come. She said yes, without hesitation, unaware that she was walking into a theater I had built. I prepared the house meticulously. The table was set with care, wine chilled, dishes simmering with familiar scents that spoke of comfort. Everything was crafted to feel safe, ordinary, familial, because the ordinary is the most devastating backdrop for revelation. They arrived on time. His parents complimented the decor. His siblings joked with him. Her laughter floated through the room like it always had. No one could have suspected the dynamite hidden beneath the calm surface. I moved among them like a hostess, pouring wine, dishing food, ensuring laughter rose at the right pitch. Inside, my heart was a war drum. Then, midway through dessert, I made my move. I stood and lifted my glass. To family, I said, smiling, the picture of grace. Glasses clinked. Laughter followed, and then I placed the folder on the table, the same folder that had slipped open at brunch. Only this time, I opened it deliberately, laying the photographs face up like tarot cards, predicting doom. The room fell silent. Forks froze in mid. Eyes darted between the images and me. His mother's hand trembled, dropping her spoon onto the table with a clatter. His father leaned forward, squinting, the color draining from his face. The cousins exchanged wide-eyed glances. He reacted first. "This isn't what it looks like," he stammered, voice high, already breaking. She reached across the table, her face blotched with panic, muttering excuses that tangled themselves into knots. "It was a mistake just once. It doesn't mean anything. Please listen." But I said nothing. Silence can be sharper than accusation. I let the room interpret what it saw, and what they saw was undeniable. Dates, places, embraces, times, receipts stapled to images. A ledger of betrayal that even the most skilled liar couldn't explain away. His mother's face crumpled. She whispered his name like it was a curse. His father pushed back from the table, jaw set, a look of disgust replacing decades of pride. His siblings spoke at once, accusations, questions, disbelief. The room turned on them with the swiftness of a mob. Not because I had asked them to, but because betrayal poisons bloodlines as easily as it poisons vows. She cried, tears streaking her carefully applied makeup, reaching for me with trembling hands. "I never meant," she began, but I recoiled, stepping out of reach. "Don't touch me," I said, my voice flat, final. And him, the man I had once loved enough to promise eternity, he broke in front of everyone. His words collapsed into pleading, his posture hunched, his excuses growing smaller and smaller under the weight of his family's fury. He looked at me as if I might save him, but I only raised my glass again, calm and unyielding. "To the truth," I said softly, and drank. That was the night the mask was torn from them completely. Family dinners would never be the same. Their reputations, once woven into the warm fabric of kinship, unraveled in a single evening. The shame that clung to them was no longer private, it was collective. And once shame is collective, it never washes off. I didn't need to scream. I didn't need to throw plates or demand apologies. The room did my work for me. They were judged by the very people they had hoped to impress, condemned by those whose approval they had craved. As I cleared the table later, I realized something. Vengeance wasn't always about the grand gesture. Sometimes, it was as simple as setting the stage and letting the truth perform. There is a moment, after the storm, when silence feels louder than any explosion. That was the silence I carried in the days after the family dinner, a silence that followed them, not me. They were the ones now whispered about in phone calls, dissected in hushed tones at offices, pitied or mocked in the circles they once commanded. I, meanwhile, walked through my life, lighter, sharper, carrying myself with the calm of someone who had survived fire and learned how to wield it. He tried, of course. Men like him always do. There were phone calls at 2 a.m, his voice frayed with desperation. "We can fix this. Don't throw everything away." I was stupid. There were messages slipped under my door. Long apologies scrawled in the same hand that had once written me love notes. He promised therapy, a fresh start, anything that sounded like salvation, but promises from a liar are just noise. And I had learned to stop listening. She tried to, in her own way. She came to my building once, eyes swollen, clothes disheveled, begging me to understand, to believe that she had been lonely, that she hadn't meant to destroy me. Her voice broke on the words. But I had stopped seeing her as human long ago. To me, she was a shadow, and shadows cannot beg for light. I didn't scream. I simply looked at her, long enough for her to realize there was nothing left to say, and then I shut the door. The legal gears had already been set in motion. With my lawyer's guidance, I filed for divorce. Clean, precise, no room for compromise. The evidence I had collected wasn't just for spectacle, it was leverage. Financial irregularities became affidavits. Photographs became exhibits. He walked into the courtroom expecting negotiation and walked out stripped of reputation and resources he thought he could shield. I didn't just leave him. I took back what was mine and ensured he would feel the weight of his greed in every future transaction. Her family, once warm to me, turned on her with an intensity I could almost pity. Almost, they had believed she was the daughter who could do no wrong, the golden one. Now they saw her for what she was. Someone who would crawl into her best friend's bed and call it love. Shame eats differently when it comes from family. It gnaws from the inside out. In the weeks that followed, I found myself rediscovering the quiet pleasures of solitude. Coffee in the morning without the sour aftertaste of suspicion. Nights spent reading instead of calculating alibis. The laughter of friends who now looked at me not with pity, but with admiration. "You're stronger than I thought," one said. And maybe I was. Or maybe strength is just what remains when everything else has been burned away. I didn't emerge unscarred. No one ever does. Trust had become a cautious thing, fragile and deliberate. But I was not broken. I had walked through betrayal, humiliation, and rage, and come out with my head high. They had tried to bury me in lies, but all they managed to do was plant me deeper into my own resilience. The last time I saw him was outside the courthouse, rain slicking the pavement, his suit damp and wrinkled. He looked smaller somehow, a man reduced to the sum of his choices. Our eyes met briefly. He opened his mouth, maybe to apologize again, maybe to beg, but I raised my hand, silencing him before the words could form. "We're done," I said. Simple, final. He lowered his head, and I walked away. The last time I saw her, she didn't see me. She was sitting alone at a cafe, staring into a cup she hadn't touched, her phone buzzing, unanswered on the table. She looked hollow, like someone who had gambled everything and lost. For a fleeting second, I thought about what we had once been, nights of laughter, whispered dreams. But betrayal kills nostalgia. I left her there, surrounded by strangers, exactly as she deserved. And me, I began again, slowly, quietly, not with another man, not with a rebound love, but with myself. I learned to breathe without waiting for the knife. I learned to smile without rehearsing it. I learned that revenge, once completed, doesn't make you bitter if you do it right. It makes you free. On our wedding day, I had witnessed the death of trust. But in the days that followed, I witnessed the birth of someone stronger, sharper, untouchable. I was no longer the bride they thought they could humiliate. I was the woman who watched them fall, who orchestrated their ruin, who walked away intact. And that was my victory.